So thank you for the invitation, for letting me presenting our work at the RIVM. Also, this is a large group effort. This has been a lot of people from RIVM and also ECHA involved. So I'm not going to mention them all, but it has taken a lot of work. What I'm going to talk to you about is basically the work that we have conducted in a nutshell back in 2016 at RIVM. And also the follow-up work that we have done afterwards in the European EU legislation arena. So what I want to show you a couple of things in this presentation is to show you how public concerns can really lead to governmental action and how important it is to show the complexity of the case and explain to the people and to come back to certain aspects of public concern, to really include in your scientific explanations how these misconceptions can lead to these outrages and how they can subside afterwards if you publish it in the right way. And also I want to show you that if you want to do work quickly, we had to do our work very quickly. It does not necessarily have to be dirty. So I hope you agree with me on that afterwards. As an introduction, I should give a little bit of introduction, although you probably know why there was a public outrage. But in the Netherlands, there was this actuality program called ZEMLA. It's literally translated as a dangerous play, which illustrated a link between leukemia cases and playing on rubber crumb across the globe. And well, rubber crumb and artificial fields are also quite often used in the Netherlands by now. And people were really concerned. Just after this broadcast, people took their kids away from the fields, and there was really high concerns. And so our ministry really had to take actions to address these concerns. So the main question was, is it safe to play on sports on these artificial turfs with rubber infill material? And from our Ministry of Health, Welfare and Sports, the request was to do a very quick technical literature search and see what other countries have done. So we also looked at the US EPA and Scandinavian of the Nordic countries, etc. And yeah, well, we had to do the work preferably yesterday. I mean, the broadcast was in October 2016, and we had to publish before Christmas 2016. So we had 3 months of work. So basically, I'm very jealous of all the work that it's been doing right now in the US, but we simply didn't have the time to do so. So we had a lot of simultaneous processes, and we had to do it we decided to do it very quickly, of course, and do it sound, but we left out certain aspects of the investigations that we would like to have done. And also you have to keep in mind, in the October, it's in the fall or in autumn season in the Netherlands, so the weather conditions are also not ideal to go out in the field, because you anticipate on the heat or on the warmer conditions to have higher exposures. So our main research questions are addressed here. Of course, what exposure scenarios were relevant. Football, we call it football in Europe. It's a very important sport in the Netherlands. So we focused predominantly on playing football, but we supposed to also cover other sports like rugby, Gaelic sports and whatnot. And well, we focus on what exposure scenarios there are, chemical substances that are present, and what also importantly, if they are being released once taken up by the body. I'm not going to talk about the levels that may cause adverse effects. That's beyond my talk at this moment. But I will focus on these remaining 4 questions. So what are the exposure scenarios? We, based on literature and also based on our Dutch Football Association, we looked at children aged from 4 years to 11, specifically also at goalkeepers, because we think they spend more time on the ground than the other players. Children aged from 11 to 18, and from that time we really have performance-oriented sports, so it's a top amateur level. that we considered, adults, and especially for certain substances which would expect lifelong exposure to be the most relevant dose metrics. We also looked at a lifelong exposure, which is a combination of all these 5 scenarios, including also veterans up to the age of 50 years. Even now in the Netherlands, there are categories going up to 70 years, so it's walking football. We did not include them there. It's just starting up at this moment, but maybe in future. Since there is a lot of information on exposure to rubber granules, from several countries, actually, we noticed that there was hardly any relation to activities on the sport. So what we did, we assumed worst-case estimates for contact based on a literature search. And this is a message that is really difficult to get to the public. So what we did, we took pictures of our assumptions. And one of the pictures, this is my own hand, actually. And this is the amount of rubber granules that we assumed that kids and goalkeepers ingest every time they play sports. And when you say it's only 200 milligrams, people will say, oh, that's not so much. I mean, but if you show them this picture, they say, oh, this kid must really be becoming constipated at a certain time. So it's a really good way of communicating to the public using a lot of pictures. And this was another one showing what the dermal contact was. These are 3 A4 pages. We weren't allowed to take children from the street and attach rubber granules to them, so we took this picture to show this is the contact for 2 hours continuously leading to exposure. So people get a grasp that your assumptions are really worst case. So this is important. Now we made assumptions on what contact may take place. So then the big question was, which has been talked about before, what substances are present? So unfortunately, I didn't see any surprises from the previous presentations. But the next question is also, if it's in there, will it be released under certain conditions? So we did some content versus migration analyses. And the content analyses were performed in 100 pitches across the Netherlands, and we took them in a period over 7 days. They were vacuumed from the fields using the FIFA standards for field inspection. So there are 6 samples from every field, and they were from all across the Netherlands. So these are the white dots in the Netherlands. But it's a small country, so it's not that far away. So real climate condition changes are not relevant in our case. And the main results of our analysis were that there was a presence of the PAH, the polyaromatic hydrocarbons, phthalates, the benzothiazoles, and also a couple of phenols, along with heavy metals and also VOC substances. The phthalates, by the way, surprised us a little bit because they should not occur in rubber granules, but we think they're originating from the grass blades or from the backing of the field. We're not quite sure. We haven't investigated this yet. We were happy to see that they were supported by other public literature and industrial data that we acquired during our research, and they were all in the same range. And we didn't see any large variations in content of our analyzed substances across the pitches, independent how old the pitches were or how old the rubber granules were. And we hypothesized that this is also caused by the annual replacement of parts of the field, because they're portions of the rubber crumbs disappear during play over the year, and they will be refilled again. So maybe there is a lot of continuously mixing of the rubber crumbs. Based on our risk assessment screening on content analysis, so this information together with the exposure scenarios, we decided to focus further on the PAHs, because this was the only group of chemicals which had a hint of possible risks for the human health. So I'm also now focusing only on the PAHs for the remainder of my talk, actually. For the migration test, we did an oral route examination. For the oral route, we did an examination using an in vitro system simulating the stomach and small intestine and using those body fluids and to measure the migration and bioavailability of the rubber crowns, which looks a little bit like this. Little adjustments were required of this system because normally chemical substances could simply migrate from the stomach to the small intestine area of a region. In this case, the crumbs would not migrate, so they had to take them out and replace them into the other fluid compartment. The main results for the PAHs is that only 9% of the pHs of the rubber granules were indeed released to the stomach and the intestine fluids. And the maximum migration value, which was slightly higher than 9%, was used in our exposure assessment and further risk assessment. For the dermal route, we decided to use artificial sweat, and you have to keep in mind we also use this test for other substances as well. So we acknowledge that this is not the best fluid to use for the PAH actually, because PAH is a lipophilic compound. Nevertheless, we found a release up to 0.02 percentage of pH content released into the receptor fluid. We did look, of course, towards other studies, one of which is mentioned here, the Fraunhofer study from Germany, which did a 10-day study, and we did it only for 2 hours, which mimics our exposure scenario a little bit better. But they were more or less in the same range. So there was the Fraunhofer was a factor 2 higher actually, and we had to make a decision: do we go for the 2 hour that we selected ourselves, mimicking our exposure scenario better than the 10 days? Well, that's obviously up for debate, but still we thought we were quite worst case in our assumptions actually. And again, we used the maximum migration values from our own study in this case. So to show you what influence this has to either work with the content data and with the migration data is that with using content data, the dermal route was really dominating the exposure and consequently also the risk. Having looked at the bioavailability, the picture completely changed. And also the risks were much lower than using only the content information. And this is also a clear message to the public that where in content you know you're exposed to hazardous substances, if they do not come out, the risks of those substances can be significantly lower. And based on all this information and a lot more that I skipped for this presentation actually, but is that overall we were very conservative in our exposure assessment approach. And one of the main assumptions was that someone playing sports is always playing on artificial turf, which is really an overestimation of our risk. But still we found acceptable extra cancer risk levels slightly exceeding what in the Netherlands is called the acceptable cancer risk level of 1 to the -6 and was only slightly exceeded. So based on this information, we concluded that the risks were negligible and concluded that playing sports on these rubber infield fields were safe. Animations. So now this was the picture drawn up in the Netherlands. So we concluded it was safe, but still we had a recommendation in our main report that despite the fact that current levels of exposure are safe, there is still this case that under European law the maximum allowed content limit is way higher than what we found on the fields. So if, and with way higher I mean factor 10 to 100 higher. So if those levels are actually met, then we have an issue with the risk. So we decided there was a follow-up action needed on a European level. And in Europe you can opt for the restriction process. And in this case, you have to make sure that there is a claim of unacceptable EU-wide risk for humans and or the environment before making your proposal. And what we did was making a theoretical assessment, what would happen to risk levels if you would fill up the content limit in the rubber granules. So it's a theoretical case, it's not a real life case. For this restriction proposal, we decided also to extend our scope a little bit. So the REACH principle also includes the safety of workers, for example, not only the general public. And in this case, we also included the people installing the fields, for which we also anticipated to have a fairly high exposure. I mean, they are able to protect themselves probably better than the general public, but still it has to be safe. And also professional players were this time included. And as mentioned before, the rubber granules are not only used on sports fields nowadays, but also at playgrounds, not necessarily in the crumb form, but also in mulch or flake-like structures. And this was also included in our restriction proposal. And this has been submitted July this year, and is now in the process of for conformity check to be able for the scientific committees to look at those proposals. Briefly, to look at the slide, and I'm sorry I don't have a pointer, but briefly here you show a picture of on the x-axis the risk levels which are linked in our case to the content limits. And our restriction proposal 1 is mainly saying, well, you should restrict to a certain level, in this case 17 milligrams per kilogram, by ways that you do suggest industry to take some actions to meet this level and to ensure that the risk levels are, in our case, considered acceptable. We also did another calculation where if you want to go to the acceptable risk level of 1 to the minus 6, this would really mean that in Europe the manufacturers of the rubber crumbs are not longer able to make sure that the content limits are met. So in fact they have told us that it would mean a total ban of this approach. So in our proposal we decided to go for the risk reduction option number 1, to restrict to the 70 milligrams per kilogram, because this same restriction proposal is also based on the same worst case principles that we used previously in the RVM case. So in short, this is our restriction proposal at this moment, and it's also published on the ECHA website, so you can find all the main report and all the background reports there. The timelines for this restriction is that we are now in the submission phase, so it's in the center of the slide, submission in July, and now it goes through the scrutiny of the 2 scientific committees, which not only deals with the risk assessment part, but also with the socio-economical part of our input. And afterwards, if they have to form an opinion on this restriction proposal, maybe it can change because of their opinions, and then it has to go through all kind of comitology processes in the EU, and then enforcement may take place or not. They could reject it as well. To finish up on the RVM part of my presentation, meanwhile other things are happening there. We are looking also now at the environmental impact of having the rubber crumbs. I mean the public outrage really subsided after our work on the human health part, but now focused towards the environmental part. And we have shown that there is some little concern. I'm sorry, this is still in Dutch. Also, the report is still in Dutch. But the surrounding soil of the rubber granule fields and also the sediment in surrounding ditches are now a little bit of concern in view of mainly of the metals that are present there. Also, the European Chemicals Agency is now working. They have a preliminary report published in 2017, which was also used for our restriction proposal, and includes more or less the same things that we have done before. Again, they also recommended to lower the limit values of the PAHs and possibly also other relevant hazardous substances. And as a result of their preliminary report, the EU Commission also commissioned them to look into other chemical substances and also to help us create a restriction proposal. So they are at this moment in the process of gathering a lot of additional information on infill material and making priorities on where to start first with their next steps. If they find other substances of concern, they will start the process of making restriction proposals potentially for those substances and or also looking to the environmental part of the risks. So that is basically what I wanted to tell you about RVM work and ECHA work. So, thank you.